Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Brennan Center for Justice event. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with New York University's School of Law. I'm Mike German, Liberty and National Security Fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice. I'm happy to be your moderator this afternoon. We're grateful to our partner in producing today's event, NYU's John Bradamus Center, that advocates for civil debate in politics and public policy. For those listening, please share your questions for the panel by typing them into the Q&A box and let us know where you're watching from. We'll take as many questions as we can during the program, and sometimes I'll reframe them to combine questions. So it might not be in exactly the same framing, but I'm trying to get to the question, to answer the question that you're asking. So I'll do my best. The FBI established its first Joint Terrorism Task Force, or JTTF, in 1980 in New York City, bringing a multiplicity of federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies together to leverage their effort and resources to investigate and prosecute crimes committed by groups that the FBI alleged were involved in terrorism. Since these agencies all had different laws, regulations, and policies, they signed an agreement called a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, in which they agreed to abide by the FBI's rules. These rules are known as the Attorney General's Guidelines, which had been promulgated just a few years earlier after the Senate's Church Committee investigation exposed FBI abuses targeting civil rights leaders, anti-war protesters, and others seeking social and political reform. These guidelines were as stringent, if not more stringent, than the laws, regulations, and policies governing most state and local police at the time. So it may have seemed like a wise choice despite the FBI's history of abuse. Over time, however, as joint terrorism task forces proliferated across the country, subsequent attorneys general began modifying the FBI's guidelines, mostly by weakening them. After 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act, and Attorney General Ashcroft again weakened the guidelines, making the FBI's authorities far less stringent than many state and local laws governing police activities. Attorney General Michael Mukasey weakened them even more significantly in 2008. Civil rights groups have accused FBI JTTFs of inflicting harm on local communities through racial profiling, harassing home and work visits, suspicionless surveillance and investigations, placement on no-fly and selectee lists, and the withholding and exploitation of immigration benefits. These tactics are all authorized under current federal guidelines. Civil rights and community activists and community groups in Portland, San Francisco, and Oakland organized grassroots campaigns with their city legislatures to hold local police accountable to local laws and ultimately withdraw them from the JTTFs when the FBI refused to make them accountable. We have invited advocates from each of these cities who will discuss their efforts to organize public resistance to JTTF activities, enlist their elected representatives, craft legislation, and ultimately end local police participation in JTTFs, which can provide a model for other localities. Let me introduce you to our guests. Zahra Balloo is the Executive Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations in the San Francisco Bay Area. Javeria Jamil is a staff attorney with the National Security and Civil Rights Program at the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. And Brandon Mayfield is an Oregon lawyer and co-author of Improbable Cause, The War on Terror's Assault on Civil Rights, along with his daughter, Sharia Mayfield. Welcome to everyone.
Thank you.
Brandon, I'll start with you because you participated in the earliest effort, which was to get the Portland Police Bureau out of the JTTF. But first, why is it as a legal matter that we should be concerned about state and local police officers working on FBI joint terrorism task forces?
Well, before I share with you my reason why we should not be involved, I want to thank you personally, Mike, Zahra, Javeria, for all of your efforts, work with your local coalitions in California, in San Francisco, in Oakland. And Mike, your work, I mean, with the Brennan Center, even before, your cooperation with the ACLU. And it's an honor for me to be here with you on this panel. So first of all, why should we be concerned about state and local police officers working on JTTFs? Federal agents and officers, they have a different job than local police. Their job is to affect the very narrow interest of the U.S. as it primarily relates to things like immigration, mail, treasury, and of course, national security, but not local domestic policing. We have a separation of powers for a reason, and it's to protect the people from too powerful, too overreaching, and centralized federal government. And essentially, it's a balance between the state and federal power and between the government, I mean, the state and the people. Rise of the JTTFs and the conflicts you're seeing within these Joint Terrorist Task Force are symbolic of and a violation of these concepts of separation of powers and balance of powers. And essentially, these task forces are an extension and a tool for the federal government to gain greater control over state, cities, and individuals. And the Constitution emphasizes that the power not given to the U.S. is reserved to the people and then to the states respectively. So, Mike, you mentioned, just briefly how the Patriot Act had sort of changed the playing field. And I just want to kind of like share with you and the viewers just a core concept that we have protections under the Constitution. And particularly I and here in Portland, we focused on many things such as profiling, but one of our big focuses is having investigations that don't meet probable cause requirements. So the Fourth Amendment requires probable cause before you search or search somebody, arrest somebody, or their persons and property. And that is something that is prohibited by federal officers. But there's an exception under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, things that are strictly national security. These federal officers, they have an exception to that Fourth Amendment requirement. And the Fourth Amendment applies to states and subdivisions of the states. In other words, city, police, law enforcement, state law enforcement, and they don't have that same exception. And therefore, you have federal officers that are operating with less than Fourth Amendment requirements, a special exception to do specifically things like see if somebody's spying on the U.S., somebody is trying to harm U.S. national interest from abroad. So it's strictly for foreign intelligence, or it was initially. And in other words, you couldn't have these type of open-ended searches and surveillance unless the primary purpose was to gather foreign intelligence. And FISA was created because of these abuses that you mentioned in the 50s and 60s, where spying was going on by the federal government against political activists, MLK, ethnic minorities, immigrants. And that's why we had the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was supposed to safeguard that. And since that time, we've had the Patriot Act, which lessened some of the requirements. In other words, now the federal government can now start these open-ended investigations, not just strictly for foreign intelligence, but now as long as that's a significant purpose. In other words, all the other purposes, such as domestic law enforcement, they can do that. And whereas before FISA, all the courts thought you could never use that information used for foreign intelligence that you gathered for domestic prosecutions. Afterwards, that was still in question, but after the Patriot Act, it's used, quite frequently just for the information that's gathered from these investigations are used for domestic prosecutions, which it shouldn't be. And so that's the big reason why it's not the only reason. We
Right.
have a history of abuse by the U.S. government of targeting, immigrants. Initially it was Japanese Americans, and then it was communists in the 60s. And then it was, it was Muslims after 9/11, and now BLK, members, and even Antifa. We have the Attorney General recently saying Antifa should be labeled a terrorist organization, which is just it's a political activist group. It's not even a real cohesive organization.
And Brandon, for the viewers who aren't aware, of course, you have personal experience being victimized by these expanded powers. When the FBI falsely accused you of involvement in a horrible terrorist attack in Spain. by misidentifying a fingerprint on some of that packaging and linking it to you, even though the Spanish police objected to that fingerprint identification. How much do you think your religious beliefs had to do with why the FBI made a rush to judgment and leveled such harsh accusations with such a de minimis evidence to suggest it could be true?
Well, what you'll find is in these investigations, typically the government, when they get a search warrant or an arrest warrant, they have to submit an affidavit in support of that search or arrest warrant, which they did for me when they arrested me under the material witness statute. And if you look at that arrest warrant in support of my arrest, right, that affidavit in support of my arrest, it, except for the bogus 100% claim that there was a fingerprint match to my fingerprint to a bag of detonators in Spain. Other than that, every single other justification was that I was Muslim, that I associated with Muslims, that I had represented Muslims, that my wife, an Egyptian national, aka Muhammad, was Muslim. And so therefore it was obvious that, you know, that was one of the main factors for that arrest.
And how much do you think your case heightened the issues that the groups that were working on the JTTF, so that the movement moved forward to remove the police from the JTTF in Portland?
So in Portland, as you said, like the first JTTF was 1980, I think, started in New York, and they spread across the country. So now we have about 200 across the country in 56 different field offices. And I think Portland joined the JTTF in the late 90s. And as a result of that, the ACLU and Portland Cop Watch, which is a local advocacy group, well, it's a group that wants police accountability. They joined together and it became on their radar. They realized that Portland had been part of this JTTF for, you know, a couple of years. So in 2000, they started advocating for, why are we in? We should get out. And then 2011 happened. And of course, then we started seeing efforts, and we became suspicious that there was religious profiling going on of the type that I just shared with you in my case. But we were seeing a lot of that here in Portland and across the country. There was a lot of FBI knocks on doors to Muslims at their work, at home. We knew this. And so there was that advocacy going on even, you know, before 2011, afterwards. And in 2004, Oregon, along with a number of ACLU chapters, they sent a FOIA request to see what these JTTFs were doing. And it was revealed that they were spying on political activists, immigrants, Muslims, you name it. And so it was confirming, it's almost like we were going back in time to these things that spawned FISA for safeguards and that came out of this church commission that you mentioned earlier. It's like we're going back to the same things, doing the same things we were doing in the 50s, 60s, kind of like all over again. And so the short answer to your question is there was also already that groundswell by these local organizations, and people were concerned that we shouldn't be involved in the JTTF. But when the FBI arrested me wrongfully, and later the Spanish police had to come out and say, no, it's not, you know, you're not involved. Brandon's not involved. We've determined that fingerprint belongs to an Algerian national named Hunani Dayoud. Then the government looked, you know, was pretty embarrassed and looked pretty bad. I mean, at a minimum, you could say it was, you know, overreaching, but it was because of that bungled job. That was the straw to break the camel's back, so to speak. And as a result of that, we got out of the JTTF in 2005, and I believe we're the first city, Portland, and I'm proud of that, to withdraw from the JTTF for civil rights / transparency, accountability reasons.
Great, thanks. And Zara, CARE is the largest Muslim American civil rights organization, and obviously, I imagine was hearing a lot of complaints from the Muslim communities and MEMSA community. What kind of tactics were you learning about the FBI engaging in and the involvement of local police as well?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Mike, and really everyone at the Brennan Center for pulling together today's conversation. It's so nice to be with what feels like old friends that I've been working and building with for over a decade, to, to talk about and reflect on a campaign that we've worked really hard to be winning in, but some of these wins have been difficult. I was a first-year attorney at the end of 2009, just coming into working with the Muslim community and care for a long time post 9/11, and even prior, when I studied civil rights history, I had learned about how communities of color, and in my experience, Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities were being visited by agents with the FBI, questioned about who they were with, what they were doing, where they prayed, what they knew, what their political activities were. And so I was just starting to represent people who were experiencing this. And it sounds almost like it's out of a movie until you get that phone call for real and someone says, well, there's 2 agents at my door and they want to talk to me. Or someone, will say, like, I was taken somewhere and asked to take a lie detector test, or I was questioned at the airport. And so all of that was happening in the backdrop when, in about 2010, then Police Chief George Gascon, now a celebrated and progressive district attorney in Los Angeles, who has done what feels like a 180 from the George Gascon we met at the time and then worked with for over a decade, made some incredibly racist remarks, right? To put it kindly, made some very racist remarks at a fundraising breakfast. He said something to the effect of, we are as at risk of an earthquake as we are of, members of the Middle Eastern community parking their van in front of this building and blowing it up. And I was like, what? Like, how did those words come out of your mouth? And when he was confronted by a reporter, rather than change course, he dug in deeper. He said, oh, I meant, people from Yemen and Afghanistan. And that really lit a fire in the community. We saw some incredible mobilization of, just a very diverse cross-section of people in San Francisco who said, if this is the highest ranking law enforcement officer in our city and county, and this is what he says and thinks of us, how safe are we? Because all of this is happening in parallel to increasing hate crimes, where we're telling the community, call the police to protect you. It, as a result, catalyzed civil rights leaders, activists, and lawyers to ask some deeper questions, right? He's saying this. What are the interactions with the police in the community like? But also, what are the underlying policies driving these interactions? And that's really what brought to the forefront the conversation of the Joint Terrorism Task Force in San Francisco. We learned through Public Relations Act requests, through engagement with elected officials, and through a lot of really hard meetings with the police department, that our worst suspicions were in fact true. Police officers in San Francisco were being assigned to the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. They were being stripped of the requirement to perform to the very high privacy standards and civil rights standards set in San Francisco and even in California. And they were targeting members of the Arab, Muslim, and South Asian community. We looked to Portland as a model, and over 80 organizations came together. I mean, your traditional civil rights organizations like the ACLU, Asian American organizations like Asian Law Caucus, Muslim and Arab organizations like CARE and Arab Resource and Organizing Center, the National Lawyers Guild, LGBT groups, Black groups. It was just this incredible coalition. And over the course of several years, what we did first is pass legislation, originally the Safe San Francisco Civil Rights Ordinance, that sought to establish and really reiterate what I think many of us had hoped would already be true, which is that police officers who are employed by the San Francisco Police Department are subject to San Francisco standards. And to ensure that that was actually being practiced, once it was passed, the police department was required to put forward annual reports, public annual reports for review. So we passed the legislation, which took several years, took champions on the Board of Supervisors, and again, a lot of community mobilization and advocacy. And so we thought, okay, this is great. This is step one. This is moderate. We're not asking you to leave the Joint Terrorism Task Force right away. Prove to us that you can respect our civil rights and do what you say you need to do. And so we worked with them then over the next few years to assess the reports. It was like pulling teeth. First and foremost, to get a report, then you would get an incomplete report. And we literally had community members who were coming to us saying, I'm being visited by the police and the FBI together under the guise of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. They're asking me questions about my First Amendment protected activity. And then those very cases, which should have been in the reports, were not showing up. And so several years of advocacy later, I mean, we're talking about a conversation that started in 2010, and we've been working on it through January of 2017. The city reached a breaking point. They were up for renewing their memorandum of understanding with the FBI. They had failed to satisfy community groups and civil rights organizations for several years with inadequate reports. And frankly, Donald Trump had just become president. And so there were a lot of concerns about what Donald Trump's FBI might do to minority communities. And so with all of that coming to a head, the city of San Francisco said, you know, we're not going to renew this MOU with the FBI, and we are going to do now what the community has urged us to do and what we think is strategic, and that is to end our cooperation with the Joint Terrorism, with the FBI, because we can't respect our community's privacy and civil rights, and we can't follow our own laws if we continue in this pattern and in this formation. That's where we are now. I'm happy to talk about where we've come, but I think we'll do that.
Yeah, we'll catch up with that. Let me bring Javeria in. Javeria, the U.S. obviously has an unfortunate history of unfairly targeting Asian Americans as national security threats, going all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and Brandon mentioned Japanese internment during World War II. Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus was formed to serve the Asian and Pacific Islander American communities, but was also a leader in advocating against FBI abuses in the war on terrorism post 9/11. Can you talk about how Asian Law Caucus comes to this work?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So before I start, again, thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be part of this panel with Brandon and Zara and you. I, look up to each and every one of you, and I'm super new to this work, and I always, you guys are like my mentors. So thank you for having me. So in terms of the Asian Law Caucus, or ALC, we have a legacy of fighting against unjust national security policies that criminalize and scapegoat communities of color. And this legacy really stems from our work in the Coram Nobis we led in the Fred Korematsu case. And so for us, after 9/11, there was a really clear parallel between the treatment and internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and the scapegoating of Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities post 9/11. And so that's really what prompted us to start our national security and civil rights program. And I think along the way, we've come to really own that program. And it's important to understand that there is a significant overlap between AMEMSA, what we term as AMEMSA communities, and AAPI communities, right? There's a huge Muslim population in East and South Asia, and it's represented here in the diaspora as well in the United States. And so as an organization that serves the AAPI community, our national security work that focuses on AMEMSA communities and focuses on, the abuses of the FBI and other national security policies, it really, fits in really well with our mission and who we are as an organization.
And I appreciate your comments, and I want to make sure that that based on your work, you've more than earned a place at the table here. So thank you for all the good work you did. And you work in both San Francisco on the JTTF issue to remove the San Francisco Police Department, and also in Oakland across the Bay Bridge there. Let's focus on Oakland. How did the conversation start in Oakland, and how did that effort get started?
Yeah, so, I think first it's important to keep in mind that what we did in Oakland, we learned a lot from what had happened in Portland and San Francisco, both in 2017, but, since then, and during the time that we were trying to hold Oakland accountable, and even in 2020 last year, when we finally were able to push OPD or the Oakland Police Department out of the JTTF. In terms of how the conversation got started, a few different things happened, I think, that made Oakland the perfect place for us to go next. So for starters, it was 2017, as Zara has already mentioned. There was a growing distrust of the FBI under Donald Trump. Even before becoming president, he had used really inflammatory rhetoric against Muslims, against Black communities, against Latinx communities. And so just generally in the Bay Area, right, there was a mistrust of the FBI. And in some ways that made the ask for the ordinance that was modeled after San Francisco, it made that ask for transparency and protection easier for us in Oakland than it was perhaps in San Francisco, or would perhaps be even now under a Democratic administration, right? I think some of the other factors that got us started in Oakland was, one, Oakland has a rich diversity of communities, right? Black, Muslim, Arab, Latinx, amongst so many others. And most of these communities have been targeted by the FBI over the past several decades for different reasons, right? The Oakland Police Department also has a history of civil rights abuses against communities of color, and because of which they've been under a federal consent decree for the past 17 years. It's still active, it's still ongoing. And in the year or two leading up to our push for the ordinance in Oakland, we had also been getting a lot of cases from the MEMSA community in Oakland, with community members coming to us and telling us that they were being targeted by the Oakland JTTF. Folks were showing up to their house, folks were showing up to their work, asking them questions. And so instead of so we have to think about a solution that would protect the community as a whole and not just individual members who are coming up to us. And so really that's, why we opted to go to Oakland. And I think finally what is what made Oakland the best choice and what is also unique about Oakland in some ways is that it is one of the only places in the country that has a privacy advisory commission, which provides surveillance oversight in the city, right? And the commission, especially the chair of the commission, Brian Hofer, shared ALC's concerns about OPD's partnership with the JTTF. And we both wanted to find ways to protect the community from the threat that the JTTF posed. So that's really where, that's really what prompted the work to get started in Oakland, and that's really where it happened. I think just similar to San Francisco in some ways, we were able to pass the ordinance because we had a diverse coalition of faith leaders, of civil rights organizations like AROC, like ACLU, and we also had the support of both, the community that lived in Oakland, right? Especially the Yemeni community. I think there's so much that can be said about how organized and how strong they are politically, but also of faith and community leaders, right? So imams in different mosques in Oakland, but also Christian faith leaders who came into to this coalition to help pass this ordinance. And I'll end it by saying all of this obviously wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have a champion in the city council. And we found that with Lynette McElhaney, who is not part of the city council anymore, but she really helped us, push that ordinance through. If you ever talk to Brian, he'll tell you how after the first city council vote, unanimously approving the ordinance, the FBI actually got in touch with McElhaney and tried to scare her into withdrawing her support for the ordinance. But she really, stuck with the community and, helped make this happen. So I think it was an effort that wouldn't have been possible without all the grassroots support that we got, but also from the support that we got from the coalition and from the Privacy Advisory Commission that has been really the biggest champions for us here in Oakland.
Great, and that actually is a good pivot to the next issue that Brandon, after Portland removed the police department from the JTTF in 2005, that wasn't the end of the question. The FBI then worked to try very hard to get Portland to rejoin. Can you tell us about what happened? You're on mute, I think.
That's right. We were out since 2005, but we were still participating, like maybe like on a case by case basis. And I want to make one other point, that the mayor at the time in 2005, Tom Potter, he was a former police chief here in Portland, and one of the things he wanted, he was asking for a top secret security clearance, because here in Portland we're unique. We have the mayor is also the commissioner in charge of the police bureau. And so it makes sense, if you're going to be assigning officers to the Federal Joint Terrorism Task Force, you want to know what they're doing. You want to make sure they're following your Oregon laws, the Fourth Amendment, as I mentioned earlier, and some of the same laws that Zara was mentioning in San Francisco, we have here also in Oregon. In fact, we even have some more protections, additional protections. Number one, we're a sanctuary city, so we can't use resources to be doing immigration work that ICE, typically does. You can't just arrest or detain somebody here in Oregon, and we haven't been able to since 1987. In that sense, we're also at the forefront of this. We were one of the first sanctuary states to prevent that. And so there was concerns, and you want, as a mayor, to have that kind of control. And he said, he asked for it, and they didn't give it to him. And so that was another impetus for getting out, as well as some of these other reasons. But we stayed out until 2011. We got back in, and it was primarily as a result of an FBI entrapment operation where they targeted a young Somali youth, a teenager who just recently graduated from Westview High School. It's just outside of the Portland metro area. And they assisted him in paying for gathering, providing bomb making materials, even helped him to explode a bomb just outside of Corvallis here, which is just south of the Portland metro area. I mean, actually helped him to ignite, set off explosives, and then also allowed him to stage it was fake, but unbeknownst to him, a fake bomb attack at our annual Christmas tree lighting, downtown Portland, Pioneer Square Christmas tree lighting. And as a result of that, naturally, it had the effect of, it created a scare, and we believe, here in our coalition, and I believe that it was a pretext to try to, and a move to try to get back into the JTTF. And that was the result. We actually got in on a semi-permanent basis from 2011 to 2015. And then in light of, if you recall, back at that time in 2015, we had these terrorist attacks that were going on in Europe, like in France and England. There was these various attacks, I think it was discotheques in different places. And because of that additional, and it's always on a pretext of scare, that we have these diminishment of our rights and this encouragement to get back into these JTTFs or adopt the Patriot Act, for example, as we've been discussing, or, FISAs, for example. And that's when we got back in on we actually assigned our officers, at least 2 of our officers, on a permanent basis, formally with the JTF from 2015 to 2018. And then in 2018, locally, people were just so fed up with what's going on and the hypocrisy with this, and what a lot of people perceived, as I said, it was like an entrapment of this young Somali youth. What had happened, to me earlier, and there was other examples, and of course, even with BLM, protesters, even though that happened somewhat recently,
Black Lives Matter protesters.
Black Lives Matter, protest and activists. We have, chapters here. We have those concerns as well. There was this growing groundswell of concern, and just as Javeria had mentioned, the different organizations there in Oakland, San Francisco, same thing with Zara. By 2018, we had as many as 15 really seriously engaged, local grassroots organizations, and they were very diverse, very deep, some of them very involved. So as I said initially, it was ACLU, Portland Cop Watch, Peace and Justice Works. By 2018, like I said, we had over 50 groups, again, like I think Javeria said, and Zara, a lot of local churches, ministries participating. We had the CARE. We had our local, chapter of CARE. We invited you, Zara, in 2018. You, Mike, to speak in 2018 when we had a panel city council, hearing on whether we should get in or, stay in or get out. And of course, we actually got out in 2019 again. But I mean, those groups were as broad as, the Democratic Socialists of America. They're very engaged. National Lawyers Guild was back in 2011. Jewish Voice for Peace, Portland Resistance, Unite Oregon, which is an upstart that's been pretty strong here as of lately. 350 PDX, which is more environment oriented. They've been very, helpful as late. NAACP, local chapters, and Latino Network, even Veterans for Peace, and Physicians for Social Responsibility, and Portland Independent Business Bloc. And I just say that because we're starting to have a growing interest by diverse groups. Like some people perceive this as being sort of a liberal, spearheaded kind of an effort, or only by immigrants. But I think what I like about this, I'll call it a movement, is I think more and more people are seeing that it affects everyone, and that you're starting to see some cooperation between even members in Senate, passing legislation like USA Rights from both sides of the table.
There's a question from the audience that is trying to understand the relationship the police have to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So I just want to make it clear that, when the police join the task force, they actually sign this memorandum of understanding that makes them effectively agents of the federal government. They now become deputized federal officers working under federal rules, even though they continue to be paid by the local police department. And in Oregon, Brandon, you mentioned that there's actually a statute about what kind of information the police are allowed to collect and retain, and that's the Oregon Revised Statute.
It's 181A250.
Right. And so if there are practitioners out there looking for their own state or local laws, they might look at that and see how it was used in Portland. Zahra, in San Francisco, the police department had a general order that, again, was established from previous episodes of civil rights abuse. But that general order was much more strict about what San Francisco police could do. So in addition to the transparency issues where they go over and we never find out what they do, there are all these laws and regulations. Javeria, many of the Oakland police regulations were the same, the anti-racial profiling and anti-immigration policies. So what did you learn about the difference between why we needed them out of the task force? In other words, obviously, if there's some kind of actual terrorist event going on, they have phones, they have computer networks, they can communicate with one another. But why is it important to keep them out of the task force?
Really, Mike, I credit you for having done so much to teach me as a young lawyer about this, right? Is that the gap that many of us point to is they're doing these things and they're not being transparent about what they're doing. But the real sort of bigger and underlying problem is they're not supposed to be doing these things. They're not supposed to show up at someone's house and ask them about what they blogged. They're not supposed to go to someone's place of work and ask them which mosque they went to. And so what we found over and over again is, by the way, that the FBI refused, and this is where it was different between San Francisco and Portland. In Portland, at least they showed up to defend themselves. In San Francisco, they never showed up to a public hearing. They never publicly answered questions, and very often tried to even limit the ability of the police department to answer those questions. But they were very often lobbying, and even in some instances, as we discovered, as we got hold of various documents through Public Records Act requests, through litigation, and through public pressure, also frequently just lying about whether, the officers could do their job without breaking local laws. All the while also advocating for changes to the department general orders, right? And so just a complete disregard for the hard-earned local standards that had been established. And I think this is also why Portland, San Francisco, and Oakland are so special, because in addition to really great state protections, there are also really important city and county protections that have been long fought over the years. And so what we learned essentially was that the FBI was acknowledging behind closed doors that they could not follow local law. And if the local police department would give them officers, those officers wouldn't be able to follow local law either. Those officers would not be able to be transparent either. And so part of reaching the breaking point in 2017 for San Francisco is not only are the community organizations not letting up, it's also that the FBI is holding on to an archaic position, one that does not keep pace with what's expected in progressive cities like these. That says essentially, like, we get that you have no standards, we have standards. And if we're going to give you police officers that we pay for, that also, wear our uniform and carry our badge, and whose actions then have a negative impact on the reputation of the entire department, we're going to need you to behave a certain way. And if you can't, then it won't work.
Yes.
Thank you for that. And there's another question from the audience about somebody mentioning a client who received an intimidating visit from a police officer who was working with the FBI. And Javeria, I know that is a common tactic, the sort of visit, unannounced visit at your home or at your workplace. And can you talk about how intimidating that is when somebody saying that they represent the Joint Terrorism Task Force appears at your place of employment, and how the individuals can protect themselves from that kind of activity?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And Zara, feel free to jump in if I miss something. But I think for starters, it's really intimidating, right? Because you have somebody showing up, whether it's your work or your home, somebody showing up in uniform with weapons, right? Like knocking at your door, asking you questions. You don't know if you can actually walk away or not, because, the one thing that I found working in this area over the past few years is that no matter how, no matter what our like socioeconomic status is, a lot of our community members just don't know what their rights are, and a lot of our community members, especially those in the immigrant community, are coming from places where they think that if they just put their head down, it's the problem's going to go away, right? And they're coming from, some of us are coming from countries where police power and state power and the terror that comes with it is really real for us, right? And so when we or our community members, I don't want to say myself, but our community members encounter FBI agents or police officers working with FBI agents, and bringing down like the power of the state with them to ask these questions at work, or even at home at like odd times, it really is like really traumatic for a lot of people, and a lot of people just don't know what to do, right? I think in terms of like how they can protect themselves, the best way is you shouldn't engage with that police officer or that FBI agent at all, right? If they had a real reason to come talk to you, if they really thought that like you had done something wrong, they would come in with an arrest warrant, because they have that at their disposal, right? But the fact that they're not coming in with an arrest warrant, they're just showing up to work and just saying like, oh yeah, we just want to have a conversation, and if you have nothing to hide, like what's the harm in it? That in itself is just like an intimidation tactic, like making people feel like, oh yeah, I have nothing to hide, so I can talk. But no, you shouldn't talk, because even a small mistake that you make inadvertently can actually lead to a prosecution by the FBI against you for like lying to the FBI, right? Like a small thing like that. Something that we constantly say, an example that we constantly give in our Know Your Rights presentations is the FBI asks you, when did you travel to Canada? You say March 2nd, but in fact you actually traveled on March 5th. And like if those dates of travel are somehow even tangentially relevant to whatever it is that they're looking into, or related to what they're looking into, they're going to slap you with like lying to the FBI charge, right? So it's really, really important not to talk to the FBI, even if you've done nothing wrong. The best way is to say, look, I know my rights. I'm asserting my rights to stay silent. Give me your business card and I'll have my attorney contact you. And the best thing about this is like, you may not have an attorney at that very moment, but you can call one of our organizations. You can call CARE in your state. You can call Asian Law Caucus in California, and there are like numerous other organizations all across the country. You can call Project South, for example, in Georgia, right? And you can have an attorney represent you, because all of us know that this happens, right? And all of us are equipped to help you in this. So yeah, the number one advice that I give folks is don't talk to them, get their business card, and just call an attorney right away for representation.
Great. And having worked as an FBI agent, number one, knowing part of that tactic is intimidation, right? I mean, typically, where the FBI should be working on organized crime groups and other criminal groups, of course, that can be a helpful tactic. But when they're targeting people who just exist in a community, exercising their religious practices or political rights, that's where it becomes problematic. And of course, having police officers who aren't given those kinds of powers participating in that amplifies what they do. And there was a question that I think I can answer about why the FBI needs the JTTF to do its job. And one of the things to keep in mind is the FBI, despite its large footprint on our society, is actually a small organization. There are only 12,000 sworn badge-carrying FBI agents around the country and around the whole world. So they need to have a force multiplier that they use with these task forces to deputize state and local and other federal agencies to do FBI work. And that's why they need this. I mean, when I first went up to Portland, working for the ACLU, they asked me to come up and testify in the Portland City Council. And I figured, okay, this is a small city, it'll be no big deal. But I get there and the FBI General Counsel is testifying as well, that I realized how important the FBI saw this as a threat to their model. And I think that's very possible. And there's another great question in the chat asking if this person lives in a sanctuary city and wants to know how that's compatible with local police participation in the JTTF. And if I'm not wrong, I believe I'm right that Portland, San Francisco, and Oakland are all sanctuary cities as well. And the JTTF and the FBI are very open about their exploitation of immigration benefits, both in a situation where somebody applying for benefits might get a visit from the FBI, but also if somebody's not cooperative with the FBI, they might have trouble getting the benefits that they otherwise deserve because of their refusal to interact with the FBI. So how important is that issue for convincing policymakers and city leaders that they need to look at this relationship? Any one of you?
I can go first and then folks can add. I mean, in Oakland, we definitely highlighted the fact that Oakland is a sanctuary city when we were pushing in 2020 for Oakland to leave the JTTF, right? So one other thing that I think a lot of people don't know is that the FBI has something called a baseline collection plan, which basically entails every time the FBI or the JTTF open an investigation against someone, and I use investigation in a layman's term and not the way that the FBI uses it. Every time they do that, they collect, certain information, baseline information on the individual. And one of the pieces of information they collect is whether or not this person is, a US person, like, right, are they documented, are they undocumented, right? And that information is then uploaded to a federal database that ICE has access to, right? And so one of the points that we made in Oakland was that act in and of itself, if an OPD officer is engaging in, right, is actually against OPD sanctuary laws. I mean, Oakland sanctuary laws, right? Because Oakland sanctuary laws require all city officers not to engage with ICE in any way possible, right? And like the fact that an Oakland police officer may be doing this or may be complicit in doing this, makes this partnership go against our sanctuary policies. So I think that's one way, that's one thing that we highlighted. And the second thing that we highlighted, Mike, was what you mentioned, which is the FBI and the JTTFs use their immigration consequences to having these like discussions or conversations with the FBI for individual immigrants, right? So one of the consequences that we often see in AMEMSA communities really is that the FBI will, like you mentioned, if you do not cooperate with them, you can end up on the no-fly list, right? If you don't cooperate with them, they will delay the adjudication of your immigration petition. So you're applying to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. Well, good luck. You're going to just have to wait 3 years and find an attorney to actually sue the government to get you your benefit. Otherwise, you're not going to get it, right? And it's not like they will make a decision. They'll just make you wait in limbo forever, right? I think the other piece to also keep in mind is that the FBI and specifically the JTTF has worked with ICE, in certain parts of the country to deport undocumented immigrants because of their political activity, right? So there's a really there was a case in Texas, I believe in 2018 or 19, where JTTF worked with ICE to deport a documented individual because he was very politically active to Mexico. So, I mean, I think those are all the different ways. And those are all the different things that we in our Oakland advocacy highlighted for city council members to make those connections for them.
Right. And I'm going to combine a couple of questions in the chat. But one of the things that we saw particularly in San Francisco and Oakland was making public agreements and then having private workarounds from those agreements. And I know in San Francisco at one point, there was a memorandum of understanding hammered out that had specific protections that later we found out they then subsequently signed a secret memorandum of understanding that wasn't there. There were public statements that the SFPD officers on the Joint Terrorism Task Force had no problem complying with the San Francisco PD general order, but then a private memo suggesting that order needed to be changed because everybody from the San Francisco Police Department were being asked to do things that were illegal. So the question from the chat is, how do we keep on top, or how do we keep from this in and out situation? What do we have to do to make sure that out is out for good? And how do we expose these kinds of backdoor agreements?
I don't know if you're going to call on one of us, but I'm happy to jump in. This one's always really difficult for me because in representing people who are visited by the FBI, I am trained to know that agents can lie. And so if you can lie in a one-on-one interaction where someone's life and liberty is at risk, then what stops this agent's boss, this agent's PR person from lying publicly? It's, the kid who cried wolf, is he lied enough that you could never tell when he or she was telling the truth? And this is really what I struggle with in public negotiations with law enforcement, is are they being forthcoming with me? Now, one of the things that has been an important facet of the advocacy in this regard has been, and there was a question in the chat that struck me also, is like, if we change the agents, does it matter? I was like, no, because the good agents like Mike German leave because the systems are broken. And the systems can't be fixed simply by individual good agents, because there are these permissions to do things that most of us would find morally reprehensible, like lying. So in the public advocacy, what's been really important is to build in accountability measures, right? So if you will enter into a new agreement with the FBI, it is subject to public review. And that at least ensures that our elected officials, right, can strip the power to enter into secret agreements from local law enforcement. Now, could we come to a place where we could just be like, oh, we're done, we're never going back in and we don't have to work on it? I mean, I think, the four of us and, a lot of the people in the, sort of who've worked on this before would love to be like, yes, we've achieved sanctuary city status. We never have to worry about ICE. We've gotten out of the JTTF. We never have to worry about the FBI. But I worry that be there Republicans or Democrats in power, the move to use law enforcement to give people a semblance, false as it may be, of security is what continues to pull us back. And so what came up also in the comments, right, is this question of like, well, January 6th and the domestic terrorists. There are enough laws on the books right now for law enforcement to hold white supremacists accountable. And you mentioned, they have phones. They can call each other. They don't need to lend each other police officers stripped of any accountability to say, oh, we know of actual planned criminal activity that is forthcoming, that we have evidence of, that we did not violate someone's First Amendment rights to get it. They can do all of that without more power. And yet continually the push on both the right and the left is for more police power. And that's where I think that even in cities where we've, had these wins, we have to keep monitoring. And I think Portland, I'll stop, but I think Portland's a good example of this for me. It's like they were out, then they were in, then they were out. And so it's like, it's a long struggle.
Right. And you mentioned there are some questions in the chat about JTTFs and white nationalists or white supremacists or far-right militia violence. And I know in Portland that has been a longstanding issue, the lack of enforcement against these groups when they engage in violence in Portland and other parts of Oregon. So Brandon, why do you think it is that the JTTF is hyper aggressive against some groups and yet seems to neglect public violence committed by white nationalists and far right militias?
I think that traditionally it comes, from top down, which is our concern, that this separation of, local police powers and federal national security kind of authority. So you're getting more of this centralization of federal control here locally. So as we've been talking, once these local officers are assigned to the JTTF, they have to follow the AG's guidelines. And so the AG's guidelines since 2011, under our former attorney generals, have been targeted. They target Muslims, Arab Americans, and more recently, as I was saying, political activists like Antifa under Attorney General Barr, previous Attorney General Barr, Ashcroft before, after 2011, 2001. And even under Obama, I think wasn't it Mike Mukasey? He was head of the FBI. He's the one that helped lower these standards. And we have assessments, where you can open an investigation without even any kind of particularized facts regarding, the target or the subject. Just to reiterate what Zara was saying, that we don't feel like we can be involved at all in these JTTFs. In other words, local officers cannot be involved in any city anywhere. If there's anybody watching and they're thinking, hey, should we get out? I would say, yes, get out. You need to get out, because even on the Fourth Amendment alone, you can't square those two things. You can't square any local state or subdivision of a state, county, city, a law enforcement officer being on these JTTFs where federal officers can work under these rules and guidelines that are less stringent than these local players, protections and guidelines they have to follow. We can't do it. And if you're a sanctuary state, like if your JTTF is part of ICE, then your local Portland police officers, city officers, they can't be working with them and sharing information as Javeria, as you pointed out. You can't square those two things. And why is it now that there's more focus on, traditionally, there's been a focus on, Muslims since 2001, but there's also more and more across the country. You're starting to see more focus, at least since 2014, 2015, like in Minnesota, JTTF, they're investigating Black Lives Matter protesters, and, even more recently. And so I was arrested in 2004. And I remember one of the first things I said is, if it's not going to be me today, it's going to be you tomorrow. Meaning, they might be focusing on Muslims now, and I know they're going to continue to, but mark my words, they're going to start focusing on you. And so, yes, I think it's good to start. It's not that we want heavier focus on white supremacists and white nationalists. That's not what we're looking for. We want equal protection. We don't want the government that's targeting immigrants and African Americans and Arabs and Muslims and political activists and environmental activists. We want it to be fair across the board, equal and fair across the board, and that's not the way it has been traditionally. And so anybody who's trying to say let's get into a JTTF, don't go down that rabbit hole.
Great, thank you. That's very important. And it's, there's obviously we want law enforcement to focus where there is actual violence and crime. And that's why these expanded powers under the Attorney General's guidelines are so problematic, because they let law enforcement at the FBI and the state and local that attach themselves to the JTTF to work where there's no reasonable suspicion of wrongdoing. And that's where that bias starts to drive investigations. I'm afraid we're out of time. First of all, to the panelists, thank you for all the work that you've done for a long time now. I really appreciate it. I'm really proud to work with you on these issues. And you've all agreed to be available if people in the audience are looking for information about how they can start this kind of project in their own cities. So I appreciate that, and we can be helpful to putting them in touch with you. But Zahra Balloo, Javeria Jamil, and Brandon Mayfield, thank you so much for appearing. Thanks again to the New York University's John Brademas Center for collaborating with us on this program. I'm Mike German. Thanks for coming to the event and all your great questions, and thanks for supporting the work of the Brennan Center for Justice.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, everyone.